Hello and welcome to Picklehaube Gaming, and today we'll be taking a sort of theoretical look at alternate history in the video game industry, in particular, if Sega were to make a successor to the Dreamcast. So let's sort of here's some pretext for this stuff. So Sega, in our timeline at least, released the Sega Dreamcast in 1998 in Japan, 1999 in America. It is sold for the low sum of $250. The Sega Dreamcast at the time becomes the fastest selling console in history at that point. But due to the console's low cost and the amount of, computery bits in the Dreamcast, Sega is producing at a loss, and because of the failure of the Saturn and the expensive failure of the Saturn, Sega is not in a good financial position. So Sega pretty much relies on arcade games sort of as a crutch for the Dreamcast. Meanwhile, the PS2 gets announced, then released, which then that becomes the fastest selling console in history. And Sega just couldn't compete. They just couldn't put the marketing muscle together to successfully fend off the PS2. And Sega had this really expensive game called Shenmue, and Shenmue was super innovative. But guess what? Shenmue wasn't a console seller. So Sega poured millions upon millions of dollars that they didn't have into a game that wasn't the fortune changer that Sega wanted. So what happens? The Dreamcast gets discontinued in March of 2001. Games still come out for it for the foreseeable next year or two, but by 2003, the Dreamcast is dead. So the Dreamcast, it's gone the way of the dodo and disco. But what if Sega made a console after the Dreamcast? What happens? So let's go back to 1999, and the Dreamcast is released. It is either released at a price where Sega gets some of that money where it isn't made at a great loss, or the Dreamcast sells a lot more than expected. So Sega releases the Dreamcast and releases it with good launch titles and makes a shit ton of money. However, they do not pour that money into Shenmue, but instead use it to try to fix the Dreamcast. They try to put all that into marketing to push the Dreamcast so it can be put into other homes. Sega also doubles down on the effort to get third-party developers back. After EA goes out on Sega tries to win them back, like how Tom Kalinske did back during the days of the Genesis. So they try to work with Electronic Arts to try to get back what they had lost, while also courting other third-party developers, investing in several second-party developers to help bolster the Dreamcast's library. And then the PS2 gets announced. So Sega then puts that money invests in marketing and to get a killer app by the PlayStation 2's launch. And they release that killer app. And right now is the console war between Sega and Sony. So Sony and Sega trade blows with popular games. Sony releases Dark Cloud. Sega releases, friggin' Sonic Adventure 2. Blow by blow, they take it out. Meanwhile, new competitors reach the market. The GameCube. The GameCube in this timeline doesn't get all the Sonic games that it got, but instead just friggin' did as well as it did in this timeline. Sega also still gets that cash injection from the CEO of Sammy Holdings, which saved Sega post Dreamcast. But in this case, it is the Sega is still making enough money where they can not do and pull a Shenmue, but instead is able to use it to survive and do well enough for them to start work on a new console, next-gen hardware, which they base off one of their arcade machines to save on development costs. So Sega is doing well for themselves. Then the Xbox gets released. The Xbox release does essentially the same thing as it did in this timeline, except it siphons away it becomes real competition with Sega because Microsoft caters to the same group of people that Sega wants to go for the people who want hot arcade action, for people who want to play action-packed games. They go to Xbox. So Sega invests in making a first-person shooter of their own, which they release. But now Sega wants to get the ball rolling on the next generation hardware. So they release, 2005 comes, Microsoft released the Xbox 360. Sega shortly thereafter releases, in between the release of the Xbox 360 and the PS3, releases a hypothetical 6th generation console that for ease of imagination we'll be calling the Dreamcast 2. So the Dreamcast 2 is released. Sony then releases the PS3 in 2006. And the reasoning behind the cell processor was because Sony saw what Xbox was doing and they were like, that's not going to work. But then they saw what Sega was doing. They're like, hot shit, we need to make a super powerful console. And this is a way of Sony competing with Sega. They make their console as powerful as it can be, holds Blu-rays, and tries to get back at Sega. And then Nintendo releases the Wii. So, while the Dreamcast would be a bit more powerful, I would say the Dreamcast 2 would theoretically be a bit more powerful than the Xbox 360, but not as powerful as the PS3. So technologically speaking, it's sort of in this middle area. And this is when Sega releases Shenmue, or at least they should release Shenmue. And it's this revolutionary game, does all these things, takes advantage of the next-gen hardware. But does commercially well enough. But, and this is a big but, by the way, here's why the console would fail. Because, one, Sega doesn't fully recover from its financial problems from the failure of the Saturn. While in this alternate timeline, it does financially well enough where it's able to support another generation of consoles, Sega can't put into as much money invest in much money as into first and second party development as Sony or Xbox could. That, and also market erosion, because Sega sort of exists in a sort of in between the casual audience and the hardcore audience. Look at the Dreamcast's library. It has a lot of hardcore experiences, but also a lot of casual experiences. So what happens? Well, Xbox with the Xbox 360 is siphoning all the hardcore gamers, with Gears of War, with Halo, with Grand Theft Auto, with a lot of these other games. Sony takes whatever hardcore gamers they can get, but because of how expensive the PS3 is, it doesn't do this as well as the Xbox 360. Which then brings us to the Nintendo Wii, where it focused so hard on the casual market. So it would siphon a lot of the casual gamers from Sega. So Sega is left with these hardcore, diehard fans but there's not a whole lot of them. And Sega can't go on doing a lot of this shit for much longer. So as time goes on, as 2006 rolls by, Sega begins to feel the attrition of not having enough money to spend on these current gen experiences. Like, Sony's going balls deep into Uncharted. Xbox is doing a bunch of other things. Sega, they're the scrappy underdog, that's for sure. So the Dreamcast 2 goes by 2008, 2009. Sega at this point begins to crumble under its economic issues. The console begins to make a loss, and Sega begins to slowly put their foot off the gas pedal on the console. And in 2010, they make the announcement that they're going to be making third-party games, and they start porting a lot of their previous titles from the Dreamcast and Dreamcast 2 games onto other consoles, which then does very well for themselves. So Sega is recovering from their financial position, but the console is still a large drag on their resources. So 2011 comes by, and Sega announces that they will be discontinuing the Dreamcast 2. The discontinuation of the Dreamcast 2 just sort of fans knew was coming, because throughout late 2008 through to 2011, throughout the later years of the console's lifespan, there was a lot of deferred maintenance on the console and its studios. Sega still doesn't, even with their best efforts, couldn't fix their relationship with EA, and EA only gives minimal support, sports titles for the Dreamcast 2. Sega, by and large, has to make up the rest of the catalog themselves, and Sega just doesn't invest a lot of money into other games. Sega would try to court some indie developers, because Minecraft, of course, but by then it was just too little too late, and the Dreamcast 2 is discontinued 2011. Third-party games continue to come out for it from 2012 to 2013. Let's say a Minecraft gets ported to the damn thing, and it does well enough. But by 2014, 2015, support has dried up. The console is no more, and the Sega console legacy is dead. So, in my alternate history, Sega makes a 6th-gen console. At first it does well, but due to Sega's financial troubles and them never being able to recover their number one position that they had during the early to mid 90s, things just doesn't play out the same as they intended to. I mean, of course, we could do another alternate history scenario where Sega goes balls deep into the Saturn, puts all their eggs in the Saturn basket, doesn't do a lot of the mistakes the Saturn did. As such, Tom Kalinske remains with Sega a little bit longer, sees through that the Saturn is successful enough where we can, comfortably move on. But I mean, this is mostly just a theoretical discussion about if Sega realistically, with the mistakes of the Saturn still alive, releases a 6th-gen console. Anyway, this has been a very interesting video to make. If you like this kind of content, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.